Today we are going to focus on Jonah chapters 1 and 2 and learn an important lesson about God and about ourselves. Specifically, we're going to look at God's sovereignty and our human preferences, the relationship between the two. In Jonah chapter 1, it begins with God called his Israeli prophet Jonah to go to Nineveh to preach against its evil. This is verse 1 to 2 says this. And we may wonder, why did God give Jonah this task? If we basically read through the book, it's not a long book, but end of the book, verse 4:11, God kind of gave the answer, because God was concerned about so many people in Nineveh, even though the city was evil. But there are hundreds of thousands of people, and also animals, cattle. They are all God's creation. So God was concerned about so many people and animals. God was so concerned about his creation. So he wanted to save them. So that's the reason why God sent Jonah to preach so that they may repent. History showed that Assyria was Israel's worst enemy at the time when God called Jonah, and Nineveh was the center of Assyrian Empire. It's kind of like the empire's capital city. So given, and also we know from the history that Nineveh was known for its cruelty, and it was once called by another prophet, Nahum. The city was once called a city of blood. So you can imagine the how evil this city was. So given this history, do you think Jonah would obey God's call and to carry out this task? And from the book of Jonah, we know that Jonah disobeyed God and fled from him. This is in verse starting from verse 3 all the way through chapter 1. So Jonah actually didn't obey God. He just fled away from this task. So why did he flee from God? Let's think about this for a moment. Given this history, given the background, we could reason that Jonah, he preferred Nineveh to be destroyed than to be saved. And also notice that he actually tried to flee to a place called Tarshish. This is a port city. We are not sure about its location, but it's typically in the Bible, it means a faraway place. It's a port city, maybe by the Mediterranean Sea, but it's far away from Israel. And most important, this place is to the opposite direction to the Nineveh. So basically, Nineveh was northeast Israel, but Tarshish was far west to Israel. So this tells us the what Jonah was thinking, right? He tried to run far away from this task. And then, starting from the next verses, we start to see the God's sovereignty over all kinds of the scenarios, all kinds of the situation here. So basically, the first thing is that God showed His sovereignty over the storm. So God stopped Jonah by throwing a storm in the sea because Jonah was on board a ship heading to Tarshish, right? And then God just sent a storm, a strong storm to stop him. And in response, actually, the action of Jonah, the book tells us that the Jonah tells us how Jonah responds to God's action in verse 5. So we can know what did Jonah do, right? So he didn't care about the storm. He just went to the bottom of the ship and fell to sleep. So did he know the reason of the storm? Of course, right? From the development of the story, we know that he apparently knew the reason of the storm. It's God who sent the storm, but he still didn't want to turn back. He still want to head to a faraway place. And then, in contrast to Jonah's action, let's spend some time to watch the actions of the sailors. So what did the sailors think when they each, the Bible tells us, they each cried out to his God? So what did sailors think when they did this? They must have thought that the storm was a divine action, which is correct, right? Because it's God who sent this storm. But they didn't know the reason why the God caused this. And they didn't even know which God actually sent the storm. But they realized this must be a divine action. So they cried out to their own God, right? And also they wanted to know whose God actually caused this, and so that they can try to pray and appease to this God, right? And they casted a lot, right? Lots. And then they found out, it was Jonah. Actually, his God sent the storm. So, and then next we can see the contrast between Jonah and the sailors to God's sovereignty in the storm again, right? And the sailors, once they knew it was Jonah's God who sent the storm, and then they feared Jonah's God, and they basically try to appease this true God. In verse 14 to 16, we know that once they know that, they offer sacrifice to God. So basically they know God has the sovereignty. So they try to appease the God as they try to respect God's sovereignty. But in contrast, Jonah would rather die than submit to God's will. So he basically, when the sailor asked him what they should do to calm the storm, to appease God, to calm the storm, and Jonah is very ironically, he asked the sailor to throw him into the sea. So that tells us that he would rather die than submit to God's will to go to Nineveh to preach the message of God. So that's the contrast. So between Jonah and the sailors, we can see the sailors on the one hand, they respect the true God. Once they knew him, they made sacrifice to God so that they can appease God, right? And they know God's sovereignty is over their opinion. So they want God's sovereignty above all, right? But for Jonah, he has his own preference. He didn't want to go to Nineveh. So he overlooked God's sovereignty. So he would rather die than obey God. So that's the contrast. And then we see God's sovereignty was not just over the storm, right? So the God's sovereignty was further shown in his dealing with Jonah himself. Let's see next what happened once these sailors to save the whole boat, right, or the whole ship, and they has no choice but to throw Jonah into sea, and then everyone would think like Jonah would die, right, in the sea. No one can survive in the sea. It's like a vast water and with the strong storm. There's no one would imagine that he could survive. But God's sovereignty showed in the sea. God provided a great fish to save Jonah from drowning in the sea. So this is in verse 17. So the great fish swallowed Jonah into its belly so that Jonah wouldn't die in the sea, right? And then in the belly of the fish, and Jonah started to call out to God in his distress, because that once in the water and in the belly of the fish, actually he's facing almost certain death, right? From humans' point of view, no one can survive either in the sea, deep water, or in the belly of a fish. No one can survive that. And then Jonah started to call out to God in his distress. And then we see God's sovereignty showed over the fish again. So you see, God's sovereignty started from showing in the storm and then in the sea. Now it's showing in the fish, over the fish. And God saved Jonah from dying in the belly of the fish. No one has survived in the belly of the fish once you are in there, right? All this like digestive material will kill you, right? But God protected him and saved him. And Jonah, from the book we know that Jonah lived in the belly of the fish for 3 days, and then he realized it's God saved him. So he praised God for saving him from death in the sea, also in the belly of the fish. This is in the beginning of the, actually it's in chapter 2, right? So chapter 2, verse 8 and 9, and Jonah praised God for saving him, right? And then we see God's sovereignty again. So God just didn't just stop right there. He commanded the fish to deliver Jonah to safety. So basically the fish vomited Jonah into the dry land so that he's safe now. Not only didn't he die in the sea, in the water, he didn't die in the belly of the fish. And eventually he returned to the dry land. So he's in safety now. So all this shows that God was in charge of everywhere. So in the boat, in the sea, in the storm, in the fish. So God's sovereignty was showed everywhere. And Jonah basically tells that Jonah could not run from God in spite of his hope to do so. So Jonah chapters 1 and 2 actually is a good lesson about God's sovereignty and our human preferences. As we can see from we just explored, God's sovereignty is over all things, including human will. The sovereignty of God is clearly demonstrated in Jonah 1-2. It all started with a call from God for his prophet Jonah. God has his intention in the call, but Jonah has his own preference too. The problem was his was different from God's. So we Christians often face with the same kind of situation today. So this passage, Jonah chapter 1-2, has really relevance today, has a lot of applications today. So for Christians today, at times we struggle with whether to follow our own preferences or to submit God's will. And to be sure, Jonah's preference was not an unreasonable one. His hatred toward Nineveh was justified by the historical context. As we just said earlier, Assyria was invading Israel, trying to destroy Israel and kill God's people. And Nineveh was the political center of Assyria. And it was known for its cruelty, and it was called by another prophet, Nahum, as the city of blood. So you could imagine how cruel the city was, how evil the city was. And the Bible actually contains records of the conflicts between Israel and Assyria. Assyria actually eventually brought the fall of Israel in 722 BC and drove Israelites out of their homeland and took them to exile. Jonah, as the prophet of Israel, had a good reason not to love this enemy. Today we also have valid reasons or excuses for our own preferences. We may like to share God's love and the gospel to some people, but not to certain other people. As a Chinese, I knew that the Japanese invasion to China in World War II has left a painful memory for many Chinese people. So when it comes to sharing the gospel to Japanese people, I'm afraid that some Chinese Christians may have their own preferences. Another example is sharing the gospel to Muslims today. For many Christians, Muslims are probably the last people they would want to reach out to for various reasons. For situations like this, if we know God's calling for us to make disciples for all nations, should we let our own preferences get in the way of following God's call? Jonah 1-2 is a good place for us to discern God's sovereignty versus our own preferences. God is sovereign over all things, as we have read in Jonah. So if he calls us for these missions, we cannot run away from them. God is serious. We need to learn the lesson from Jonah as well as from the sailors. The sailors didn't know the true God before their encounter with God. Yet they knew how to watch, listen, and discern. They watched the extraordinary storm so that they knew it was the action of God. And then they listened to what Jonah told them, and they discerned from what happened and what has been said to them. So they knew the sovereign God, and they feared him and worshipped him. In contrast, Jonah let his own preference get in the way, so he disobeyed God. He disobeyed God's will. So by his own preference, but his own preference cannot stand a chance in front of God's sovereignty. As shown by the storm, the casted loss, and God's protection of him from drowning and from dying in the great fish. So all this intended to get him to realize he needed to submit to God's will. So he need to let his own preference to subject to God's will. So in the same way today, when we share the gospel, when we share God's love to people, we need to ask ourselves if we let our own preference get in the way so as to disobey God's will. If God calls me to preach to Japanese or to Muslims, will I honor God's will over my own preferences?